Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our podcast on the Stonewall riots and Pride. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first.
Stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up, gay folks.
Yes, we have.
Stand up, body cry.
After the first night of rioting, word got out about what happened, partly through word of mouth in the gay community. So the following night, Saturday night, which was technically the early hours of Sunday morning, an even bigger crowd gathered and rioting reignited. Things died down a bit on Sunday night, but clashes continued on Monday and Tuesday, and there was a final confrontation, which again was a big battle on the night of Wednesday. Martha Shelley was actually in the village on Saturday night and saw the clashes, but didn't realise what they were about.
It was Saturday night, and there were two women from Boston who wanted to start a Daughters of Believers chapter, and they were visiting New York City. And the women who were running DOB they asked me to give these women a tour of Greenwich Village and so on. So I took the women down to Greenwich Village and gave them a tour, and that night we passed by the Stonewall. And I saw these young people throwing things at cops. And the women from Boston were taken aback. They said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, that's a riot. We have them all the time." And I thought it was an anti-war riot, which we did have all the time at that point. And I didn't realize it was a gay riot, or I would have stopped and participated.
Martin Boyce was one of those who felt compelled to go back the next night.
Well, I went back because that was my hangout, my street. You see, one thing I would like to explain is I think that if anybody who listens has ever seen West Side Story, New York in the '60s was a city of turf. Everybody had their turf that you didn't go into very easily. The Latin turf, black turf, white ethnic turf. We were the only people that didn't have a turf, except finally Christopher Street did become our turf. And that invasion of the turf, invasion of the one place we could go and not have to look behind us, not have to look in front of us, not have to worry because of the safety in numbers. The one street that was really open to us, that was really a street and not an alley, not a park, not a highway, was invaded, and the bar that was the most popular there, the bar that had an opening to living like other people and dancing, expressing ourselves like other people, was gone. So the reaction to the raid, which was a very foolish raid because it was a raid in the middle of the city. Most raids occurred and most bars were on side streets that were not so available or so easy to get to or so noticeable or so public. But this was right in the middle of the village. And it was worth the fight because to hold on to some sort of dignity.
John O'Brien felt the same way.
The heterosexuals had every place else in the fucking world. Only streets, had two little streets on Christmas Street going down, and we were determined that that was going to be our space. We weren't going to give it up. So it became a turf battle. And it involved many more because they identified seeing it as their streets too. So for the same reason, because people had gotten tired, we were pushed into an area. It was called the meat rack, which is basically these were areas where nobody wanted to go to. It was smelly and dirty. It was back of trucks that normally would be moving dead animals for the slaughter, for the meat area. And these are the only places that we had to socialize, to have sex, and to meet other people who were gay. So we were in these areas that nobody else would want. And they were picking on us there too. So we just had it. There was no place else to go. This was we're going to stand there, and no matter what happens.
As well as protesters, the police were also back the following night, but this time they were prepared, and they wanted revenge for their humiliation.
The violence got worse over the nights, but we came back every night because it was the thing to do. It was the scene, it was the place, it was what's happening. It was like going to a rock concert every night and waiting around for something to happen. And every night something did happen with the police insisting that it was their streets and that we get off the sidewalks, that we get off the streets, and they were shoving and pushing, and of course that started the resentment and people then fighting back, and the police, of course, patience was less. They knew there were gays down at the trucks and having sex in the bars, but they never knew that all these other people were also gay a lot of times, and so they were frustrated with the amount of support, as I say, people gathering around, consciously not moving if they didn't have to, and the police trying to push through these crowds, where the police got it. They figured. They figured after a while, these are not just innocent people who just happen to be standing there and blocking because of wanting to see what's going on, even though there was some of that, because on Friday and Saturday night and Sunday, the village was a place that when people went to party. They would go out to bars, etc. But they got it that a lot of people there were very much opposed to the police. and they were just freaking out of the whole thing. And getting more pissed off because that they weren't controlling the streets and the sidewalks, which they had been used to. When they would tell people to move, people would move. And here they were not moving.
On these subsequent nights of rioting, there was also widespread property destruction.
But there was a bank on the corner of Sheridan and Christopher, and there was another bank down on 6th Avenue and 8th Street, and those windows were smashed by people who were protesting the police raids and brutality. So the rebellion grew in the area. It was no longer around Stonewall alone. It was all along Christopher Street and up and down 8th Street and in the areas around it. So it was mobile. So basically the rebellion was us, and we were on the move.
While the fighting was ongoing, some rifts started to open up within different elements of the gay community.
There was a bar right around the corner called Julius, which is fairly famous in the village. And that bar is a gay bar. All of us in there was packed with all these professional guys, that's women. When we were running around the streets fighting the cops were chasing us, people from Julius came out and grabbed some of our people to hold for the police. These are gay people. That was that mentality of being subservient to, hetero laws, hetero rule, and oppression, and accepting it, to the point where you actually came out of a bar and you grabbed people who were challenging the police.
Some straight people also joined in the fighting against the police.
David Van Ronk, who is a fairly well-known musician, who was an anarchist, and he was heterosexual, was arrested that first night, fighting the police. And a lot of the people who took part in the rebellion, I don't know their sexuality. Because it was not Rock Hudson, and it was not Liberace. The people who fought the police were people who could not do anything but that, because they had nothing to lose. So they didn't have to worry about jobs, they didn't have to worry about a future career, and who would find out whatever. So it was the street kids like me. A lot of the kids who were sex workers, I was not. They were working class kids. So mainly people of color was about, I'd say, half the crowd. The ones who were actually rebelling. Not the ones standing around. The ones standing around and observing, that crowd was mostly white. But, professionals, etc. But the actual troublemakers, the kids, the people fighting the cops, was only working class, with no jobs generally. A few may have had jobs, but they joined in. But their jobs would probably be working in manual jobs. Nothing in terms of any kind of professional occupations. You didn't find them there. So heavily young people after the first night. The first night had older people who were the ones who sat around on those benches, who were substance abuse users and homeless people of all ages. But there was a number of what I call older people. So for me, then I was 20. So older people to me was in the 30s. But among the gay kids, it was, there were white kids like Jackie Hormonum. There were black kids like Marsha Johnson. But the main thing is we didn't allow people generally to photograph us. So the big troublemakers like myself, we smashed cameras and stuff. So there was none of that because obviously what we were doing would get us into trouble. So there's not much film footage actually of Stonewall, the rebellion. The photos that exist are mainly people who were posing for pictures who were not actually fighting the cops for the most part. There was a few kids who were the couple of pictures like McGrath had where the kids who actually were fighting the cops were in also, but they certainly weren't showing them then. They were standing with a group of other kids, but they weren't the biggest fighters were not wanting to be seen by the cops having evidence against them because, we didn't know if we were going to get arrested, right?
Dave Van Ronk, the folk singer mentioned by John, was arrested for punching a cop on the first night of the riot. His life was actually the loose basis for the Coen brothers film Inside Llewellyn Davis. Anyway, sitting in Christopher Park the other week, just opposite the inn, Martin also told us about solidarity he witnessed from straight people.
There were two really big football type, two black guys, straight, football types. And they looked, and I remember one of them said, "Man, what's going on here?" The other one said, "I don't know." So let's go in. He said, "Hey, they're gay." He said, "They are fighting the police." And they went in like tanks. No, because, you never can judge an individual. Like my father, who saw so much oppression from the cab, or these two guys that saw someone fighting the police, and, that's your ally then in that moment. You're not just allied, you're allied at that moment. So, no, there were people, good people, strong people, street people, who really had a heart and were sincere and knew when to band together and when not. So, no, there were straight people even the first night that did help, did support, did cheer. And then later in the week, I was walking down my street, I was very loud, and there was a sanitation worker, a big, strong guy, throwing all the garbage in, and he looked at me, and I said, "Oh, God, he's going to succeed." And he gave me this look, and then he raised his fist. I can't tell you the thrill of such a man, whom everyone would assume would be so anti-gay, really recognizing something that was done. That was amazing to me. And that's when I knew the world was changing. And it changed. Amazing. I'm probably Italian, really rough guy. Not one to play around with. I could have kissed him, he would have murdered me. But, but nonetheless, that was like, wow, I said. That was important.
Martin also told us about some of his friends who participated.
Just the names of those fighters. Dead Frog Jerry, Congo Woman, Mary Queen of the Scotch, the Old Salty Dog, Captain Faggot, Miss New Orleans, Black Twiggy, White Twiggy. These were queens of the John Waters syndrome, if you want. This was the beginning in culture, too, of this world of John Waters, which was a world out there that he captured in part, but was often unconscious. It was happening at many different places. This new kind of humor, or new to the world, it seemed, of this kind of sharp, amazing, cynical humor of those kind of queens, who were really fighting for sexual freedom, merely. All they wanted was for the New York indifference about things to hit the police. And that would have been fine, but the police wouldn't even give that much, which is exasperating.
After the first night of the rioting, the demographics of the crowd on later nights changed.
The politicals came on the second and third night and fourth. But for the first night, it was just the local street kids. And they had learned from the experiences of watching television and seeing how the police were abusing people in the civil rights marches and demonstrations and the peace demonstrations, etc. So they had that awareness at that level. but they didn't have that experience except for a couple who had been in those movements. And fortunately, I was one of those people in those movements. But most of the kids that were on the streets at Stonewall were not even really drag queens. It was like a little bit of makeup, a couple of earrings. It was some like kind of punk kind of in between. It was a gender bending more. It certainly wasn't. None of these people were like wearing bridal gowns. I mean, all these kids who took part in the Stonewall Rebellion could not afford a bridal gown. Okay, they didn't have enough money for that kind of stuff. Whether they're playing drag queens or female impersonators, none of these kids were into that. They couldn't afford that. They didn't have regular jobs to pay for that kind of dresses. So it was just usually some slight makeup, rouge, earrings. Those are the kids who were into drag. It was almost as far as it went. If you put on a dress, it was a secondhand thrift shop dress. Because that's all they could afford. They weren't making big money as sex workers. They weren't getting what women sex workers were getting. Because they were considered less of value as people, so they got paid less for it. If they made $5 for a trick, that was big money. So these kids were all street kids. There was no living on a fancy apartment. It was not J. Edgar Hoover playing Mary. There's none of that. They didn't have a place to sleep with a roof over their head, not alone a place to keep the dresses and the wardrobe. There was no but almost all these kids were living on the street. And if they found a hotel for a night, they were lucky. In other words, they'd pick up a John. He'd have sex with them in a hotel, which was not the usual case. Usually these Johns would go down to the piers and the parks and have a quickie, and that was it, and with sex. But when they were lucky, these kids, they could get a hotel room where they could sleep all night in a bed, even if they were dirty old hotels. And they would bring their friends in. If they got the room, they'd invite their friends in to sleep too in the room, instead of on the sidewalks, instead of in the alleyways, instead of in the little under the steps and on top of the steps in places like most homeless people do today.
On the Wednesday night, large numbers of people turned out once more, many in response to the really homophobic article which was written by the Village Voice journalists who were present on Friday night, which was published earlier that day. In it, there was liberal use of the F word, as well as snide comments about limp wrists and the like. As well as LGBTQ people, large numbers of others from the political left, the counterculture movement and the Black Power movement came to show solidarity. Martha, who at the time was active in the Daughters of Bilitis lesbian civil rights group, read about the riots in the New York Times and realised what she had witnessed on Saturday night and thought that there was an opportunity to build on what had happened.
And I called, her name was Jean Powers. I called her. She was the one running Daughters of Bilitis, and I said, we have to have a protest march. And she said, well, if Mattachine Society, the gay men's organization, will co-sponsor it, then, we can do that. So I called the head of Mattachine Society, a guy named Dick Leitch, and proposed the march. He didn't seem terribly enthusiastic, but he said, come to a meeting that we're having at Town Hall, and propose it, and we'll see what the membership thinks. I went to the meeting. There was 400 gay guys and me. And everybody was talking about the riots, of course. They had rented Town Hall to talk about it. And it held a capacity of 400, and it was packed. And so I proposed the protest march, and Dick, who was at the head of the, on the stage at the podium, said, well, how many people want to support this? And every hand went up. And then he said, those people who want to organize it meet in that corner after we're finished talking. I went to that corner, and there were a few guys there, and we talked and agreed to meet at the Mattachine Society office to organize a protest march. And then the next thing that happened was we met at a place called Alternate U, Alternate University and Alternate YOU, where they taught things like Marxism and karate, and had various kinds of courses and groups that met that were basically radical socialists and such.
Other people who'd been involved in the rebellion were also keen to capitalise on momentum, including John, who was involved in Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, probably the most prominent New Left organisation in the country at that time.
And we put out a notice in RAT newspaper, which was an SDS high school paper, to organize a meeting at Alternate U. And we gave out flyers for that meeting. Literature was given out, and we put an ad in RAT newspaper, because it's in the RAT, you can see it. And so I was decided to be the chair. And the reason was because we had an agenda that we wanted to not just have a gripe session where people come together and complain and nothing comes out of it. We wanted to have and form an organization that's ongoing, because we feared and worried that people would just come and complain and nothing would happen. And there was about 30 people at the first meeting, and then there's the same number at the next meeting. The first meeting, there was a couple of women at the first meeting, and then a couple more at the second, and then it grew, and more women came.
And the meeting was of those of us who were gay people in gay organizations, but were very much to the left, and left people who were gay, but who had been encouraged or urged to keep their gayness secret within the left organizations, because they didn't want, the left organizations didn't want to be smeared as a bunch of communists and queers. And of course, the gay organizations wanted to be seen as middle-of-the-road Americans and not a bunch of commies. And those of us who were commies and queer met together and formed the Gay Liberation Front. And we had our march. We had our protest march. It was just a month after the Stonewall riot, and we marched around Greenwich Village and ended up in Sheridan Square Park, just across from the Stonewall Inn. And Marty Robinson, who was part of Mattachine Society, jumped up on the water fountain as we had planned and made a speech. And then I made a speech. It was like one for the guys, one for the girls. And at the end of it, I looked around and I saw, I guess, a couple of hundred, I'm not sure how many people, looking and expecting something. And I thought, well, we're not going to start a riot now. So I said, okay, I think that's it for today. We're going to go home in peace now. But this is just the beginning. This is not the end. And that was how it was. It was the beginning of the Gay Liberation Front and our whole radical movement.
The GLF was to be a completely new type of organization for the LGBT movement.
We changed that movement, the Gay Liberation Front. I chaired the first meeting. We were open to all ages. We didn't care what you dressed as, and we wanted people to come out of the closet. So it was Stonewall in the 60s was what we came out of. But so it was a different attitude for me when I'm fighting the cops who have been messing us over and using my experience. The Gay Liberation Front was organized as a basically progressive left group of gay people. It was multi-issue. We adapted the name to be in solidarity with the National Liberation Front of Vietnam fighting U.S. imperialism. That was a conscious decision on our part to do that. And so basically we had progressive politics and something very, very important that we promoted. And it became the name of our newspaper, Come Out.
In a sea change from previously, the GLF wanted gay people to come out and finally live their authentic lives out in the open.
Till Stonewall, the homophile movement was advocating privacy and to be left alone. That's all they wanted. They wanted to have the government stop harassing them and to allow them to be themselves in privacy. We argued that people needed to come out of the closet. Until people knew us, we could not change people, and that to learn how many of those there were. So our view of saying coming out of the closet was totally opposite of the homophile movement, which was privacy and secrecy. So GLF created a support system. We supported each other, and we said we were a community, and we identified ourselves, and we did something else. We identified who we were. we said we were gay. We took the word gay because that's what we called ourselves, and we made that name known through the mountains of Nepal to the oceans around this world, and everybody knows what the word gay means now. That was an important historic point that we created an identity, because until then, there was a small number of people who said they were homophiles, but, there was nobody knew what the hell that was. and so homosexual, more people knew that, but a lot of people didn't even know what that was, So, but we got it out, the word. We got it from out of the closet. We got it out clearly in people's identities and awarenesses that we were around.
The difference when we became the Gay Liberation Front was that we weren't trying to assimilate. We weren't trying to become part of an America at that point that I saw, from the point of view of what was going on in Vietnam and civil rights and all of those things. We wanted to change America, not to become part of the way it was. We wanted to overturn the system. And so GLF, we had a platform of sorts. We made contacts and alliances with the Black Panthers, also with a Puerto Rican liberation group called the Young Lords that were in Spanish Harlem in New York City. We made alliances with the feminist movement and with various socialist organizations. The idea was that we weren't just focusing on civil rights for gay people, we were focusing on an entire social change in the United States.
In addition to organising protest activities, the GLF started to try to build a radical, gay, self-organised counterculture.
We approached the bars demanding that they put up bulletin boards and that we could post literature in them. That changed also the gay community, because until then, not only the mob bars, but even the non-mob bars, none of them had space for, putting up on bulletin boards and allowing flyers to be kept, etc. We saw these bars as places that we wanted to organize. And of course, there was a lot of resistance to that by the bars, as well as the customers. But what we did is we got a community, and we started organizing around that we should have gay centers, that we should be taking care of each other, that we need to build that community, build organizations. And within a year, the whole previous homophile movement not only was no longer around, but there were now, 1,000 gay groups around the world. So from a handful of a dozen, it became 1,000, and it's grown since then, of course. And I remember I went to the last conference of the North American Conference of Homophile Organizations. I went to, and I was elected as the last president of it. And my goal as being elected was for one thing, to never meet again. So that's what I ran on. That's what they elected me for. And no more meetings of the Eastern Regional Conference of Homophile Organization were held or any groups like that. And that was what we did. We put an end to the homophile movement, consciously, deliberately. We didn't want the assimilationist, accommodation, acceptance level. That's what GLF did. It got into urging people to come out of the closet, which is unheard of. Nobody had ever advocated that before. Never throughout the entire history of the gay community and the gay movements, the organizations, and it goes back before Hirschfeld, that nobody was ever advocating that people should come out. So the gay liberation movement ideas spread. Publications were coming out more. People's attitudes were changing because we got in people's faces. We wouldn't accept it, what they were doing. And we changed a lot of things, as you may recognize over the years. We're still at it. We did not have a name for when we first started. There was a group of us. And apparently we came from different places. There was other people who were with Mattachine, but I was with a group that was on the streets with the kids. And a couple of those were political, like Bill Katzenberg and myself who were at SDS.
What we did was form different committees that did different things. I was part of the group that did the newspaper come out. So I typeset it in the typesetting office that I worked at. I went in there at night and typeset it. I wrote articles for it. Other people did the layout and did the artwork. And that was what I did. And I sold it on the streets. Other people ran dances for gay dances at Alternate U. And that was kind of an alternate to the mafia too. You didn't have to go to the gay bars. You could come to these dances, and instead of buying watered down drinks, you could buy a beer or a soda or nothing if you didn't want to buy a drink, and dance with people, and you didn't have to pay extra to get in. Of course, one night some of the mafia people showed up, and we had to face them down. They were trying to be threatening, but actually they ended up going away. So they were unhappy because we were taking away business from them. We also went on demonstrations of one kind or another. We went on peace demonstrations, and there was a big peace march that was covered by the New York Post, which was a left-wing paper at the time, and now it's an extreme right-wing paper. But Pete Hamill, who was one of their columnists, referred to us as the slim-waisted creeps of the Gay Liberation Front. He was a, quote, liberal, but when it came to sexual politics, he was still troglodyte.
Some other liberals who didn't approve of the GLF was the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU.
I went to the ACLU in New York asking them to please provide legal observers, and they said they wouldn't because it was a criminal issue, not a civil liberties issue. And when I went to the National Lawyers Guild, which is a left-wing legal group, Carlos Lamont, who headed it, a big homophobe, said, absolutely not, we won't defend perverts. And so the reason that's important is because when we did the Gay Liberation Front, if you were a lawyer, you would be disbarred if you were known to be gay and lesbian, because the American Bar Association had it as a rule that you could not be gay and lesbian and practice law.
On the other side of the law, due to the stranglehold organised crime had on gay bars, militant gay activism inevitably led to conflict with the mafia. One example of this was following an incident in a mob-run lesbian bar.
There were a couple of women dancing, and a couple of straight guys, businessmen, I guess, came in for a drink, and they were not happy with these two women dancing together, so they demanded to cut in and dance with the women, and the women didn't want to, and one of them punched one of the women and knocked her to the ground, and then the guys went out. We were really upset because, here were these women who, in this bar, who were paying extra to be at a mafia bar, and the mafia guys weren't even protecting them. So a bunch of Gay Liberation Front people, me included, men and women, went to the bar one evening, and we put on the jukebox. We danced around. We did not buy drinks. We danced in circles rather than as couples. And then I was selected by the group to be the spokesperson. So I went up to these two big guys. Now, I'm a short person. I think I was about 5'4" at the time, and I've shrunk a bit since in my old age. And I went up to them and told them why we were doing what we were doing. And they were not happy because we weren't buying drinks or anything. And they were, I guess, scared that we were going to break up the place. And they scowled at me and said, "Do you know who we are?" And I said, "I don't know who you are, and I don't care. We are the Gay Liberation Front." And then I walked away. Of course, I was scared. I was scared they were going to, do some Al Capone thing and take out machine guns and shoot us. I had no idea what they were going to do, and they didn't know what we were going to do. So I think that was successful because we never heard about women having trouble in that bar again.
Now, the term intersectionality, which many people use today to describe the connections between different types of exploitation and oppression, didn't exist back then, But the GLF fully embraced an intersectional approach, making links with other social movements.
We demonstrated for the Black Panthers when they were in jail. We demonstrated for Angela Davis when she was in the Women's House of Detention. And then, when any gay person was harassed, there was this guy, Diego Vinales, who was arrested during some police raid and was terrified because he was here illegally and jumped out of a police department window and ended up impaled on a fence and in the hospital. I don't know what happened to him afterwards, but we had a huge demonstration about that.
And GLF members didn't just join these other movements uncritically, they fought to change them, like, for example, the mainstream feminist and Black Power movements.
There was this women's organization called National Organization for Women, which started well before Gay Liberation Front. Betty Friedan started it, and continues to this day. It's still an organization, and they were very uptight about lesbians. Betty Friedan certainly was. Her attitude was, well, she called us the Lavender Menace, that we would essentially tar the feminist movement by everybody saying, oh, they're all lesbians, they hate men, that's why they're feminists. So lesbians didn't feel welcome in the National Organization for Women, although some of us were there. They were having a conference at a public school in New York City. They'd rented it on a weekend, and it was called the Second Congress to Unite Women. A group of us went in there, had scouted the thing around, and we had printed up T-shirts that said Lavender Menace and made some signs, and we put the T-shirts on and then other shirts on top of it, went into the meeting, and at one point, one of the women went behind the auditorium where the light switches were and doused the lights and threw the room into darkness. And when that happened, those of us who were part of the Lavender Menace Action, who were members of the Radical Lesbians, an offshoot of Gay Liberation Front, took off the outer shirt, and there we were with our Lavender Menace T-shirts, and some people posted signs on the walls with funny signs, things like "Take a lesbian to lunch," "Lavender Jane loves you," etc. And as soon as the lights were on, and there we were in our Lavender Menace T-shirts, I jumped up on the stage where there were a group of women who were the panel discussion group, and they were, a black woman and a union woman and one representing this organization and one representing that. And I said, here we are. We had not been asked to be part of the discussion, and the question is, do you want to go on with the panel as is, or do you want to hear from us? And I put that question to the entire audience, and they all voted that they wanted to hear from us. So we spoke about what it was like being lesbians and feminists, and that changed the National Organization for Women, which then took up the cause of lesbian rights too. And the same thing happened. There was a Black Panther convention, and I don't remember the name of it because I wasn't there, but I did hear about it afterwards, where gay people went to the Black Panther convention and convinced the Panthers to change their position on homosexuality.
Out of GLF, numerous other groups emerged. Some of them came about by splits from people who supported LGBTQ riots, but not necessarily the revolutionary objectives of the group, but they still maintained the spirit of direct action and militancy of GLF.
There was one group that split off from Gay Liberation Front called Gay Activists Alliance, and they were, again, a civil rights organization for gay people, but what they did was, instead of quietly petitioning, they would go to city council meetings and demonstrate. So the tactics had changed for them, but the long-term goal was still the same, change the politics just for gay people. They weren't interested in changing it for everybody.
The atmosphere and attitude of the GLF was totally different to the pre-Stonewall homophile movement, and the GLF basically revolutionized the whole movement.
There was a conference, I think it was again in Philadelphia, the Eastern Regional Conference of Homophile Organizations, which is what the assimilationist gay groups called themselves. And there was the Daughters of Bilitis, and there was the Mattachine Society representatives. There were representatives of little groups that consisted of maybe two people, a gay couple, and their mimeograph machine. And they all met to talk about, whatever it was. Gay Liberation Front sent people too, including me. And I was both member of Mattachine, of Daughters of Bilitis and the Gay Liberation Front. And two of my friends, one of whom had been my lover, were representing Daughters of Bilitis. Gay Liberation Front put forth a platform and asked the conference to endorse it. And it was, the right to consenting adults to have sex with whoever of their own choosing, the right to ingest the drugs of your choice. This was, in the how marijuana was bad kind of a society at that point, where it was all illegal. There was the right to control your own body, which was the basic thing. The right not to be drafted and sent overseas to get your ass shot or kill somebody else. And then the right to abortion and control of your sexuality if you're a female. One of the little gay organization guys, I guess it was him and his partner, he was a Catholic. He was for gay rights, but he was not in favor of women's rights in terms of abortion. He got up and made a speech, an anti-abortion speech, and said he couldn't possibly support that, blah, blah, blah. The two women from Daughters of Bilitis jumped up in fury. Now, they were older women, and one of them had been raped and had an abortion when she was younger. That was the one who had been my lover. And they raised hell. And as a result, the conference voted to endorse the entire Gay Liberation Front platform. So, because the guys particularly didn't want to alienate all the women, and all of us either, some had abortions or were lovers with people who had abortions or knew people who had abortions, and the pressure was on. You're either for women's rights or you're not. So that was, I thought, an important stage in connecting the gay movement with feminism.
They never said they were gay, and all that was in there was like 100 guys packed in together, not a woman in the place. And that's what it was. And that reflects today's politics of people looking to assimilate, accommodate, gay pride at the Pentagon, let's all be in the FBI and the CIA. Let's out military, we're more pro-patriotic than anybody, We're more pro-war. We're more, whatever, because they're all trying to be accepted by the very worst, because the history of gay people is that many of our people desperately looking for acceptance go to the very worst enemies to get identity and support from. Our view was we saw the society as bad, full of wrongs, totally hypocritical, and lacking any kind of value. We didn't want that society. We rejected that society, and we wanted to end that society. Okay. Now, what happened is, as people joined the Gay Liberation Front meetings, a lot of them didn't understand where we were at, and they just came there looking for friendship and friends and stuff, and they watered down the politics where all they wanted was a safe space, living room feminists, as I call them, where basically they wanted shelter, and they were scared to hell of people like me who still wanted to go out and have demonstrations and protest and, to take on the establishment because, they wanted instead just the parties, just the dances. Now, I was on the dance committee for GLF because I was on the board of Alternate U. That's where we raised our money. But I saw it as a moneymaker to pay for our political activities, not as a place for hiding. So division occurred in the GLF between the people who wanted to maintain a political focus and those who were looking for a family.
The Stonewall Rebellion led directly to the creation of the GLF, but the most crucial thing which led to its place in history being recognised was the decision by a number of LGBT people in New York City to hold a commemorative demonstration on its anniversary the following year.
So Craig Rodwell is the one who came up with the idea to have a anniversary celebration for the Stonewall Rebellion. Now, Craig was not a left-winger at all, okay? He was the owner of the Oscar Wilde bookshop. But he was a militant, okay? And, in fact, had organized demonstrations for years before Stonewall and was looked down on by a lot of the homophiles because he was so, quote, militant and wanting gay power and all. So he suggested that we have a march to commemorate the rebellion, which, of course, horrified Mattachine and the homophiles who, for respectability didn't want anything to do with Stonewall. They thought that was a terrible thing that happened. It set them back years, of their work with the police department. So we didn't have any permits, of course. The police refused to let us marching. We assembled on Christopher Street in front of Stonewall, and the plan was to march up 6th Avenue to go and into Central Park. Most of us didn't think we'd get there. The police refused to allow us to march. People don't know this. They put up wooden police barricades across Christopher Street that goes into 6th Avenue. They blocked it off. So what we did is we marched the other way. We went up 7th Avenue and then down 10th Street and got back on 6th Avenue and went north. We physically fought and pushed against the police at 14th Street and 23rd Street and 34th Street to keep marching because the cops didn't want us to march. We had no permits. They weren't going to give a bunch of faggots permits to be marching over a rebellion against the police.
Martin went to the march with his Puerto Rican friend, Bertie Rivera.
The clinching thing was not the riot to me, was the first march, and that clinched pride. They said there was going to be a march, and I went with Bertie, and there weren't very many of us, and it was very disappointing. We didn't get 5th Avenue. We got a small section of 6th Avenue. And we were supposed to march to the park, and I had imagined there were going to be lots of people, and there weren't. So we were starting to call it already the first run. And we started off we're talking 1 year later, there was going to be a march, and, word of mouth. I mean, the people that formed it now are very well known, but we didn't know them then. Just the word of mouth occurred. And we did assemble for it. We did start the march. It was extremely lonely at first. We were told to go single file to stretch us out a little more. And I was very nervous. I mean, it was problematical because the city was very violent at the time. Not too long after this, or that same year, Kent State, there was a riot of the hard hats against the hippies and peace lovers. And so we didn't know what to expect. So it was a very, very brave thing to do. But it was an amazing thing because as we kept going, it became thicker. Now, all of a sudden, there were people on each side of me. And you could see, it was an amazing thing as you looked up at windows. Just occasionally, you would see someone giving really their full support, sometimes a maid, sometimes a worker, sometimes that lived in the area with their fist raised. You could see individuals shouting out. They felt that we were right. It wasn't the majority, but it was enough to make my heart smile. I remember this one very good-looking guy, amazingly looking, blonde and gorgeous, and looked like he was fighting with himself. He was watching us. He looked weird. What he was fighting was his desire to join us, and he broke through. He jumped the line and came in with us and grabbed somebody's arm, and they were marching. It was amazing. And then the crowd kept growing and growing. By the time we were on into the 50s, it was quite a crowd. And then around 57th Street, the police told us to stop. We couldn't move anymore. And I just couldn't believe it. I said, after all this, you're going to stop us from going into the park? He said, I'm not stopping you from going into the park. There's too many of you. You have to go in and wait. Some of you have to wait. I couldn't believe what he was telling me. And sure enough, when I went in, the park was covered with a multitude of gay people. It was the most beautiful thing. And on top of this hill was this Latin drag queen or transvestite doing this amazing dance that really did represent freedom. First time I really understood modern dance. And she expressed the whole thing as we all looked up and watched her. It was an amazing event because what started off as a question mark in the village ended up as exclamation point, as I always say, in the park. So that was, after that, there was pride.
I remember marching, and I remember being in Central Park, and I remember these hordes and hordes of people, all dressed differently, and there was one guy who was dressed in a white sheet, not like a Ku Klux Klansman, but sort of like a bed sheet wrapped around. His head was bare, and he had an enema bag taped to his sheet and a sign that's saying Penn, as in Pennsylvania, Enema Club. So this was his sexuality. He liked to get enemas. And we sort of looked at him like he was weird, but then one of my friends kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, well, it's all inclusive. We're all here, however weird we are. And I guess that was kind of the feeling, like whoever you are, however weird, however different, you're welcome here, and you'll be treated with respect.
We amazed ourselves because there was, we thought there'd be, maybe if we were lucky, a couple of hundred, and there was a couple of thousand with us, and a lot of people walking on the sidewalk along in support who didn't have the guts to get out on the street. And when we got up to Central Park, we went up to the Sheep's Meadow, the Great Mall, and we had a little gay in there. Nobody had speakers. We didn't have any rally. None of us thought we were going to get there. So there was no speakers at the end. It was just people coming together, and we were delighted that there were several thousand of us, several thousand, way beyond anything we had expected. I mean, it was an instantaneous success, and it showed what you could do. In fact, Mattachine organized a counter picnic in New Jersey to discourage people. This is New York Mattachine. Now, Washington, D.C. Mattachine was Frank Kameny. He joined our march. So Barbara Giddings joined our march. People who were homophile, but they recognized how much better it is with our approach than that approach. And so, if you can imagine organizing a counter picnic in New Jersey so that your members would have, keep them away from those militants and troublemakers. Because we would not accept anything less than full respect and rights. We pushed against the cops to get up the street.
Annual commemorations continued and spread to more and more cities around the world. And through the 80s and 90s, the term gay pride and pride became more commonly used than the original language, which was normally about things like gay freedom or gay liberation. Now, many places observe Pride Month in June, a month-long celebration of LGBTQ people, history and culture, usually culminating in a pride parade or demonstration around the anniversary of the first night of the Stonewall riots. Pride in London in 1984 and 1985 came to be really important, both in the Great Miners' Strike that year and in the gay liberation movement in the UK. Our next 3 episodes are going to be about that. And in 2018, Pride finally spread to every continent, with LGBT workers on Antarctica organising an event. John thinks that there's an important lesson to be learned from all his experiences at this time.
There needs to be an independent LGBT movement because of corporate interest who, of course, oppose independent movements, and they want to, whichever way, destroy them or disable them or make them ineffective. So it's very important for those forces that they subvert and take over and eventually destroy independent movements. So having an independent, grassroots, democratic-based movement of self-empowerment is very important for the future for gay and lesbian people, for all people, in fact.
When we met up with Martin at the Stonewall to talk some more, I asked if he was still in touch with any of his old friends from those days.
Half those queens died by 1975 from drugs, and the other half died mostly from AIDS. There are very few left. That's why I started speaking. I never spoke about Stonewall until 10 years ago, because then I realized it was my duty because there's so few left. Yes, it was very tragic. They had tragic lives. There was no happy ending to their life. Not at all. And yet, look what they did. It's global now. Yeah, it's amazing. You should see these queens. They would bring a tear to your eye. How mistreated, how miserable their lives are. How poor. How off the cuff and living day to day and meal to meal. And trying to find a place to sleep that night. Or sleeping with someone just so you could be warm. And it was just not a good life.
Tragically, many activists from those days are no longer with us. Marsha P. Johnson herself was found dead in the Hudson River shortly after Pride in 1992. While she had a massive head wound, police ruled her death a suicide, despite everyone who knew her telling police she was not suicidal. It took until 2012 for activists to pressure police into reopening the case as a possible homicide. But today her death still remains a mystery. Looking back now, 50 years on, Martin reflects on what that period meant for him.
And we had changed. Everything had changed to gay people already by 1969. I mean, if you look at the gay press, it had completely changed by 1969. Gay pulp fiction had changed by 1969. We had all changed. We just didn't know. Well, the time to think about it is really about now. I mean, we didn't think much of it at first. It was just a beginning. And we didn't dwell on it. And there were so many issues to deal with in the 70s that Stonewall wasn't, I don't think, appreciated in the way it is now. I mean, now I can see myself how amazing this thing was. Then it was, to me, was just a riot that put us on the map. We were different. Gay people were different. That's what was different. And everything that came around, even the winning of hearts and minds, only could have been done because gay people were different. We were all different the next day. We didn't even know it. And that's what changed everything. I mean, I went back, to school the next week, or September, and every paper I did was gay. I mean, some of them were challenged by the professors, but I insisted. And that's what I did. And I'm sure everybody else did their way, their thing. But we all pushed forward in the smallest ways. But it meant much for the larger picture. I mean, the 70s became interesting. I mean, all of a sudden there were gay patrols to stop gay bashing, which was amazing. And lots of posters and signs announcing lots of things. Gay news, not just word of mouth anymore, which was often very accurate, but now it was in print. Something was going on. Every month added something. It was too much to take in, too much to analyze. So I think all these years that have passed, it's easier and better to analyze it because it's the only time we could do it. Because the worst thing back then was not only to be oppressed, but to be ignored. And that can't happen now.
For Martha, that time marked a shift from timidity to pride, both in the LGBTQ community and in herself.
The difference, I think, was that we did develop pride. And instead of feeling cowed and feeling like we were less than, because, with that kind of message happening all throughout society, you can't help but internalize it. And it was the beginning of shaking that off, of beginning to feel like we're okay, we're just as good as anyone else, and we have the right to be who we are. And that made a huge difference. That did mean pride. It did mean a certain confidence in what we did. And for me, I know I went through that too. I stopped trying in some ways to assimilate. I had been trying to relate to guys sexually, and it never really worked. It worked in the sense that I was able to enjoy the sex, but I never fell in love with a guy, and that's a huge difference. With a woman, I would fall in love and feel emotional passion, not just sexual pleasure. And after Stonewall, it was like, I'm not even going to bother to try. I don't care anymore. I don't care what the straight world thinks. And it kind of freed me to be angry and use the anger to try to change the world in ways that I hadn't before.
For John, confronting the police was something he'd done before, but at Stonewall, everything was different.
I was in heaven fighting the cops and having other gay people out there doing it. It wasn't a new experience for me dealing with the cops. What was a new experience was seeing other gay people joining in doing the same thing. that I'd never seen. I'd never experienced that camaraderie. I'd never seen gay people standing up instead of being victims. The hurt look ended that night. The acceptance of being repressed, of being abused, that ended the first night of Stonewall. That's why Stonewall is important, because it's not only because we formed the Gay Liberation Front, which is absolutely essential. Stonewall would have been nothing in history if we didn't do two things. One, form the Gay Liberation Front, and two, hold a march on the anniversary of it to celebrate it, which became the Pride Marches, which became worldwide.
We have won, at least temporarily, because with the current administration and the backlash, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. You never do. We've won gay marriage in this country and a lot of other countries. We've won the right to join the military openly and go kill other people at the behest of the corporations. I am not thrilled about that. And we have won certain protections depending on what part of the country you live in. We don't have national equal rights yet. But what we didn't get, and what I still feel is the biggest, most important thing, we did not overturn the empire. We did not overturn the capitalist system, and it's gotten a lot worse, as you know, the economic inequality. We are living in an empire that continues to kill people around the world en masse. I have been writing articles on my blog posts about just what the empire has done in Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and now what we're doing in Venezuela. We didn't change that. And to me, right now, that's the most important thing.
While huge improvements in LGBT rights have been won in recent decades, there's still a long way to go until everyone is free to have the absolute most basic human right there is, of just being able to be who they are. And of course, any type of discrimination is also a class issue, because if you're not rich, you're always going to be more at risk, for example, from dismissal or mistreatment by your employer. In the US, there is still no federal prohibition of discrimination against LGBT plus people, although as we finish this episode, the US Supreme Court is currently considering this. But, given its conservative bias, it's probably unlikely to do so. Trans people, especially trans women of colour, continue to be at risk of extreme violence and murder, and murders of LGBT people continue to get acquitted or get reduced punishments because of, quote, gay or trans panic defences. Around the world, only about 25 countries recognise same-sex marriage, while homosexuality is illegal in 72 countries and subject to the death penalty in 14. And things aren't getting better everywhere. Brunei only just introduced the death penalty by stoning for homosexuality, and the British territory of Bermuda became the first place to repeal gay marriage in a measure recently signed into law by the British Governor John Rankin. Meanwhile, a backlash against trans rights is growing, aided by the mainstream media, a re-emboldened extreme right, and shamefully, many of those who consider themselves feminists, socialists, and, in the UK at least, even some anarchists. But Martha takes hope in what happened at Stonewall.
It is possible, it did happen, that a small group of ordinary working-class people can change the world if you're determined and you're willing to take the risks. We did, and it's possible to do that now, and we just have to keep doing it. And I'm hoping that young people will continue to do it, and I am inspired by some of them, like Greta Thunberg in Sweden, the environmentalist, or Asma Mahfouz in Egypt, who started that Arab Spring. Unfortunately, she, I believe, is currently under house arrest, and the Arab Spring got squashed. But they made a difference, and it doesn't mean, if you try, that you're guaranteed victory. But sometimes you are. Sometimes you win, and you have to take that chance.
And of course, if you don't fight, you are always guaranteed to lose.
Stand up, stand up, stand up, stand.
that thought brings us to the end of our episodes on Stonewall, the GLF and Pride. We hope you enjoyed them at least half as much as we enjoyed speaking with John, Martha and Martin. They told us a load of really fascinating stuff which we couldn't fit into these main episodes, so we've put some of it into a bonus episode for our Patreon supporters. You too can support us on Patreon for as little as $2 a month and get benefits like exclusive early access to episodes, bonus audio, free and discounted merch and more. We are spending loads more time on our podcast through 2019, taking time out from our day jobs. But really this is only going to be sustainable beyond that if we get more support from our listeners on Patreon. You can find out more and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. If you can't afford to support us, that's totally fine. Instead, please just give us a review on Apple Podcasts, share our episodes on social media, or tell your friends about us, maybe. As always, we've got more information, photos and the like of our interviewees and some of the stuff we've spoken about on our website, workingclasshistory.com, and linked to in the show notes. John O'Brien is still as active as ever, doing a lot of work in radical history and has amassed a massive collection of 250,000 items related to social movements around the world. John is always looking for more items for his collection, as well as financial contributions or any offers of space to store or display them. So if you can help with any of that, drop us an email on info@workingclasshistory.com and we'll put you in touch. You can see Martha Shelley's writings and buy her books, including her forthcoming novel, A Meteor Shower, the third book in a historical fiction trilogy about the ancient Middle East, on her website, linked in the show notes. We've produced some Stonewall 50th anniversary merch to help support our work, as well as John's and Martha's, so check that out on our website, linked to in the show notes. This narrative was recorded by Jesse French. Theme music for this episode is Stand Up For Your Rights by the International Gay Society, courtesy of Chapter Music. Links to stream it and buy it in the show notes. It's from a great album of songs from the gay liberation movement in the 70s, so check that out. As always, thank you so much to all of our patrons, whose generous support enables us to keep making this podcast and running WCH. Catch you next time.